"Can you please make sure my daddy comes home tonight?" the little boy asked the hospital director, pressing a crumpled piece of paper against the glass of her office door. Dr. Lena Hartwell was not the kind of woman who stopped moving. Not at 7:14 in the morning, not when the hallways of Crestfield Medical Center were already humming with the controlled chaos of shift change, not when 3 department heads were waiting on her signature, and the board was breathing down her neck about Q3 discharge metrics. She moved through this building like a current through wire, fast, precise, and invisible until something got in her way. The boy was maybe 5 years old. He wore a dinosaur shirt, one sock pulled higher than the other, and he was holding a drawing in both hands with the careful gravity of someone delivering a state document. Lena stopped. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, assessing, categorizing, calculating the fastest route past the problem. He didn't belong in this corridor. Visitors weren't permitted on the administrative floor before 9 a.m. Someone had let him slip through, and she was already composing the internal memo in her head. Then he said it again, quieter this time, as if he understood that the first attempt hadn't landed. "Please, he works really hard. He doesn't sleep. I don't want him to disappear." The word disappear hung in the recycled air between them. Lena's hand tightened around the tablet she was carrying. "Who are you here with?" she asked. The boy pointed down the hall toward the nurse's station. "My dad. He's always here." Toward her. She looked at it without reaching for it. 2 figures, one tall, one small. The tall one was faded, sketched in pale gray strokes that barely pressed into the paper. The small one was bright, colored in hard, certain lines. Below them, in crooked block letters that a child had clearly labored over, "Come home, Daddy." Lena turned and walked away. She told herself it wasn't personal. The boy's father was an employee. Sentiment was not a protocol. She found out his name through HR by 9 a.m. without asking anyone directly. She simply pulled the access log for the administrative floor to identify who had swiped in before 7 a.m., then cross-referenced it with staff records. Victor Osei, registered nurse, pediatric oncology. Employed at Crestfield for 6 years. Performance reviews, consistently exceptional. Attendance, perfect. Overtime hours logged in the past 8 months. 340. Lena read the number twice. 340 hours. That was not dedication. That was a system consuming a person whole, and the person letting it happen because they had no other option. She opened the next file automatically. There was a note flagged by the HR coordinator from 4 months ago, a recommendation for a shift reduction that Lena herself had rejected without review because the department was understaffed and the coverage numbers hadn't balanced. She closed the file. It was not guilt. Guilt was a luxury she had stripped out of her operating system sometime around her 2nd year as director. What she felt now was closer to the sensation of finding a miscalculation in a report she had already signed off on. A quiet, persistent wrongness that wouldn't resolve itself. She pulled up the security footage from the administrative corridor. Watched the boy walk down the hallway, stop at her door, wait for 3 full minutes before knocking. Watched herself push through the door and come face to face with him. Watched the moment she took in the drawing. Watched herself walk away. Lena set the tablet face down on her desk. Victor Osei was the kind of man a building forgot. Not because he was small or forgettable, but because he was so completely reliable that people stopped seeing him the way you stop noticing a wall that has never once cracked. He was there before the day shift arrived. He was there when the night shift came in to relieve him. On the floor, the other nurses called him the anchor, not to his face, but in the way people say things they mean as compliments and never quite get around to saying directly. He was 41 years old. His wife, Yolanda, had died 22 months ago from a rare autoimmune condition that had taken 14 months to diagnose correctly, and 4 more to take her completely. He had worked through her illness. He had worked through her death. He had taken 4 days of bereavement leave and come back on the 5th because a parent had called asking specifically for him, and he hadn't been able to say no. Lena learned most of this from the HR file and the rest from standing outside the pediatric oncology ward on a Tuesday afternoon and watching him work. She didn't go inside. She stood at the corridor window, the same kind of window she typically used to observe floor operations, the kind that made you invisible. And she watched, sitting beside a patient, a girl who couldn't have been older than 7, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that slow movements don't disturb a sleeping child. The girl had woken up, and Victor was reading to her from a book he had clearly brought himself because it wasn't a hospital book. The spine was cracked and the cover was worn soft from use. He did the voices. Not loudly, not performatively, but enough that the girl's expression shifted from the flat gray exhaustion of a sick child into something closer to ordinary childhood. When the girl fell back asleep, Victor stayed. He sat in the chair with his hands folded and his head bowed slightly, and Lena understood with a cold clarity that he wasn't resting. He was watching her breathe, the same way his son watched him. She walked back to her office. She had the conversation she'd been avoiding with herself at 11:30 that night in the parking structure. Sitting in her car with the engine idling, unable to remember why she'd come down here or what she'd intended to do next. The hospital ran on people like Victor. It had always run on people like Victor. People who cared too much to stop, who turned their grief into overtime, who converted the thing that was killing them quietly into the fuel that kept the system moving. And the system took it. The system was very good at taking without asking. Lena knew this because she had built several of the mechanisms that made it work. She was not a villain in the story she told about herself. She was efficient. She was necessary. She had pulled this hospital out of a staffing crisis 3 years ago through decisions that no one else had the stomach to make, and she had done it without apology because apology was not a deliverable. But sitting in her car in the empty parking structure with the hum of the ventilation system and the memory of a 5-year-old boy holding a drawing like a petition, she could not locate the version of herself that made those decisions feel clean. He doesn't sleep. I don't want him to disappear. She thought about her own father, who had worked double shifts at a plant in Akron for 11 years and retired with his lungs compromised and his knees shot, and a handshake from a manager who was laid off 6 months later. She thought about the pride her father wore about it, the way he talked about reliability, like it was the only thing a man could give the world that couldn't be taken back. She thought about the fact that she had built a career out of replicating exactly that dynamic, just with better lighting and a benefits package. Lena leaned her head back against the headrest. The engine idled. She didn't cry. That's not the kind of person she was. But something in her chest made a sound like a door that had been locked for a very long time finally finding the latch. The next morning she arrived at 6:45 a.m. and did something she had not done in 14 months. She walked the floor. Not with a clipboard, not with a delegation or an agenda. She just walked, the way she used to in the early years before she became the thing on the other side of the glass, and she let herself see what was actually in front of her. She saw a night shift nurse finishing charting at 7:20 a.m. because the software had been down for 90 minutes and she hadn't been able to leave. She saw an aide mopping a corridor near the supply room with a bucket that had a slow, steady drip from a wheel that had needed replacing since last spring. She saw the break room, the one listed in the staff handbook as a wellness space, with its flickering fluorescent tube, its ancient coffee maker that required a specific sequence of button presses to work, and its motivational poster that someone had annotated with a ballpoint pen to read, "Excellency is what we take from you without asking." She took a photo of the poster and kept walking. She found Victor at 7:35 a.m. He was at the medication cart, running end-of-shift checks with the incoming nurse, explaining something with a patience that suggested he'd explained it before and expected to explain it again, and had decided somewhere along the way that this wasn't a problem. It was just the job. His son was not with him today. Lena did not approach him. She went back to her office and opened a new document and began writing, not a memo and not a policy revision, but a list. Every specific thing she had seen on that walk, every operational failure that had nothing to do with attitude or effort, and everything to do with a system that had been optimized for cost at the expense of the people doing the work. It took her 2 hours to write it. She'd expected 20 minutes. The confrontation, when it came, arrived in the form of a calendar invitation. Emergency board review. Operational expenditure concerns. 10:09 a.m. The CFO. A man named Rain comprehensible in the way that balance sheets are comprehensible. Everything in its column, nothing bleeding across the line, sat at the head of the table with the expression of a man holding a very polite knife. He had a spreadsheet. It detailed every discretionary expenditure she had authorized in the past 6 weeks. The ergonomic assessment of the nursing floor, the replacement of the break room equipment, the maintenance orders she had fast-tracked, the proposal she had submitted for a staffing restructure that would reduce mandatory overtime by 30% without cutting FTE count. "These are not line items we approved," Raymond said. We approved a cost containment cycle. What you've submitted is an expansion package dressed as operational maintenance. It's both, Lena said. You can't contain costs in a system that's losing experienced staff to burnout. At the rate we're losing them, every nurse we lose costs the hospital between $40,000 and $60,000 in recruitment and training, minimum. I've attached the calculation on page 4. We are not here to discuss your calculations, Lena. We are here because you have made unilateral decisions that fall outside your authority. I have an employee who has logged 340 hours of overtime in 8 months. She said it flatly. He has a 5-year-old son. Last week, that child came to my office to ask me to send his father home. He offered me his lunch money. Raymond blinked. That is a human interest story, he said carefully. It is not a business case. It becomes a business case, Lena said, when that man collapses from exhaustion on a floor where sick children depend on him. Or when he quits. Or when he makes an error because he's been awake for 20 hours and we get sued. Pick the version that gets your attention. The silence in the boardroom was the particular silence of people recalculating. The board chair, a woman named Patricia Chun, who had been listening with the flat expression of someone withholding judgment until she had full information, set down her pen. How much does the full proposal cost? Patricia asked. Year 1, $400,000. Year 2, we recoup $250 in reduced turnover costs. Year 3, we're net positive. Patricia looked at Raymond. Raymond looked at his spreadsheet. Give her 60 days, Patricia said. Raymond pressed his mouth into a line. This isn't how we do things, Patricia. No, Patricia agreed. It's not. She looked at Lena, which is why I'm curious to see what happens if we try. Lena found Victor in the hallway outside the oncology ward the following Thursday. She had arranged it technically by scheduling a floor visit for 7:40 a.m. when she knew his shift ended at 7:30, but she chose to think of this as operational efficiency rather than anything else. Mr. O.C., she said. He turned. Up close, he was taller than she'd registered through the corridor window, with the particular stillness of a person who has learned to exist inside their own exhaustion without letting it move through them visibly. His eyes were alert in the way that eyes get when a person has been running on adrenaline and coffee for so long that it starts to register as a baseline. Dr. Hartwell. His tone was careful, not unfriendly but calibrated, the way you speak to a person who has power over your livelihood. Your son was in the administrative corridor last week, she said. He had a drawing. Something moved across Victor's face. Not quite fear, more like the expression of a man who had hoped a particular thing might not have happened and was now learning that it had. I know, he said. I'm sorry. My sitter canceled and I had no one. He stayed in the family lounge, but he asked me to make sure you came home. Victor stopped talking. He told me he didn't want you to disappear. Lena kept her voice level because level was the only register she trusted. I've been thinking about that for a week. The hallway around them was busy. Carts, visitors, the ambient percussion of a hospital in motion, but in the 3 feet between them it was very quiet. I owe you an apology, Lena said. And I am not very practiced at those, so I'm going to ask you to accept an imprecise version of one. She paused. The system you've been working inside is one I maintained. Not because I didn't see the cost of it, because I chose the balance sheet over the people on the floor, and I told myself it was necessary, and I think for a long time I believed that. Victor looked at her steadily. He did not say it's okay or I understand, or any of the things that people say to make the person apologizing feel better. He just listened. I've submitted a staffing proposal to the board, she said. It's going to reduce mandatory overtime significantly. Your schedule should look different within 60 days. She hesitated. That's not enough, I know that, but it's what I can move right now. Victor was quiet for a moment. Then, he really gave you his lunch money, $3, Lena said, in crumpled bills. For the first time, something in Victor's expression broke open, not into tears but into the particular exhausted relief of a person who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down. He looked away down the hallway, jaw working. He's been doing that, Victor said quietly, drawing me fading. I found one on the fridge a few weeks ago and I told him it was just how his crayons work, but I knew, he exhaled. I knew what he was drawing. Lena did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. Go home, Mr. O.C., she said finally. Your shift ended 12 minutes ago. The changes happened without announcement because Lena had learned, after a long time, that announcing things before they exist is how you teach people to be disappointed. She simply made them happen, item by item, as the approvals cleared. The break room fluorescent was replaced. The bucket got a new wheel. The ergonomic assessment produced a set of recommendations that she implemented in order of urgency. The staffing restructure took longer. 60 days stretched to 74, but it moved. The motivational poster stayed. Someone had added to the annotation in a different pen. Excellence is what we take from you without asking, and what we owe you back. Lena didn't take it down. She heard about the changes the way a person hears about ripples when they're standing at the center of a pond, indirectly, from a distance, in the form of a shift supervisor mentioning that morale metrics were up, or an exit interview that flagged fewer complaints about workload, or a note from the pediatric oncology charge nurse that said simply, "Whatever you did, thank you." She kept that note in her desk drawer. She didn't know why. 6 months after a boy in a dinosaur shirt walked down the administrative corridor with a crumpled drawing, Lena was in her office at 6:50 on a Friday morning when she heard a knock at the door. 2 knocks. Small. She opened it. The boy was standing in the hallway, one hand wrapped around his father's index finger, the other holding a new drawing. He was wearing a different dinosaur shirt. This one had a triceratops, and both socks were even. "Hi," he said. "Hello," Lena said. He held out the drawing. This time she reached for it. 2 figures, same as before, one tall, one small. But the tall one was fully colored in now, solid and clear, every line pressed deep. Next to them was a third figure, smaller than both, in a dark jacket. Lena looked at it for a moment before she understood she was looking at herself. Below the 3 figures, in the same crooked block letters, "Thank you for keeping him." She looked up. Victor was watching her with the calm expression of a man who has had enough sleep, for what appeared to be the first time in a long time. The permanent tension she had catalogued around his eyes in the corridor window, the tension that she had noted and filed and moved past, was gone. "We're going to the farmer's market," the boy said seriously. "Dad said I could pick the donuts. Do you want to come?" Lena looked at the boy, then at Victor, who raised an eyebrow in a way that was a question and a small dare at the same time. She had a 7:30 call with the CFO. She had a department review at 9. She had 17 unread flagged emails and a facilities report that needed her signature before the weekend. "What kind of donuts?" she said. The boy's face broke open into the uncomplicated joy of a child who has decided an adult is acceptable. "The good kind," he said with complete authority. Lena took her jacket from the hook by the door. She pulled it on. She stepped into the hallway and let the office door close behind her. The building kept moving the way buildings do. The carts, the shift change voices, the hum of a system turning over. But for the length of a hallway, Lena Hartwell walked at the pace of a 5-year-old boy who was pointing out that the elevator buttons lit up when you pressed them, which he found, apparently, endlessly worth noting. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she agreed.